The Soviet destroyer Tashkent is an interesting case. If you're shown a picture of this ship and are familiar with warships of the period, you might think she's an Italian ship. From the hull lines to the bridge shape, everything screams 1930s Italy. For reference, here's a Navigatore-class Italian destroyer to compare against. All of this should be expected. After all, Tashkent was designed and built in Italy to fulfill a Soviet order. This was actually relatively common in the 1930s. The Italian shipbuilders were willing to work with the Soviets, and the Red Navy was desperately in need of modern ships. With a lack of experienced ship designers of their own, in the aftermath of the Russian Civil War, the Soviets looked abroad. This resulted in Tashkent and the Kirov-class cruisers, among other things. I'll look at those cruisers in a future video, but for the moment, let's focus on Tashkent. The origin of her design comes in the... I don't want to say failure, since that's unfair to the designers. Nonetheless, Tashkent came about because the previous Soviet attempt at a modern destroyer was lackluster. Those were the Leningrad-class destroyer leaders, designed after the French practice of large destroyers. Soviet designers and dockyards proved to struggle with such a leap in technology, as their only frame of reference were old imperial designs. The result would be a lengthy and protracted construction process, which yielded ships that were obsolescent when they entered service, in addition to being poor seaboats. Not strictly a failure, but also distinctly underwhelming. Deciding they wanted foreign assistance in their next destroyer design, the Soviets turned to Italy. They had already collaborated with the Italians on the Kirov class in the same time period. So, in 1935, a request was put in to 3 Italian shipyards. This used the basic specifications of the Leningrads as a base to build off of, while wanting something better. Ultimately, the victor of the contest was the submission by the Auto Company. That's OTO for reference, not auto as in car. This initial submission would see 1 ship built in Italy, while the Italians promised assistance to the Soviets to build more in their own yards. This proved to be a tad ambitious. Only 1 of those ships would receive a name in Baku. 2 others were directly ordered, but never received a name. At least 1 more modern source claims the Soviets wanted 11 Tashkent-class destroyers. 3 for the Baltic, 2 for the Black Sea, 2 for the Northern Fleet, and 4 for the Pacific Fleet. This overly ambitious plan came to nothing, however. The Italians designed and built a fine ship, arguably one of the best of her day. In the process, they forgot about the entire reason they were building the ship in the first place. That the Soviets needed help getting to the point of building modern ships of any variety. Tashkent, as a result, ended up a bit of a unicorn. An excellent, highly advanced warship that the Soviets couldn't replicate in their own dockyards. The result of this is easy to see. Tashkent would be the only member of her class ever completed. With all of that out of the way, however, what did the Soviets actually end up with? Tashkent was quite large for a destroyer of the 1930s. The ship displaced 2,900 tons for her standard loading. That's already bigger than most foreign designs at their full load. Tashkent's own full load, for reference, was 3,300 tons. Her deep loading, with fuel and other such things, rose to 4,200 tons. Utterly massive for a destroyer of the time. This size was necessary, though, because of one feature in her design, and that was speed. Lots and lots and lots of speed. The Soviets wanted this destroyer to be fast, and the Italians obliged. Not surprising, really. The Italians were quite fond of fast ships in their own right, just like the French. In any event, Tashkent was designed to reach a bit over 42 knots, which was fast even by those standards. To do that, the Italian designers crammed in 100,000 shaft horsepower. For reference, a Fletcher-class destroyer had around 60,000. The contemporary French Mogador had 92,000. With that power plant, Tashkent actually managed 43.5 knots on her sea trials. It should be noted, however, that this was without her weaponry, and on top of that, on an overload power of 130,000 shaft horsepower. You will also occasionally see a speed of 44 knots thrown around. Generally speaking, in arguments about which was faster between Tashkent and the Japanese Shimakaze. Speed arguments aside, Tashkent's more normal speed was around 42.7 knots, as if that's slow by any sane definition, but I digress. As for the rest of the design, it was more normal for lack of a better word. Tashkent was designed with 3 twin 130mm 5.1-inch gun mounts. These were supported by 3 triple 21-inch torpedo tubes for a total of 9 torpedoes, as well as 6 single 45mm anti-aircraft guns and 6 machine guns. She also carried around 76 mines and 24 depth charges, though those would end up being irrelevant to her actual combat service. And now, with this extended design history out of the way, we can move on to service history. This will, however, be on the shorter end. The ship that became Tashkent was laid down on January 11th, 1937, in Livorno, Italy. She would be launched on December 28th of the same year. Tashkent was already proving to be a fast ship, if you want to look at it that way. Tashkent proved that point in 1938, when she hit that impressive speed on her sea trials. After those trials and other requisite testing, the new destroyer was handed off to the Soviets on May 6, 1939. This was in Odessa on the Black Sea. At the time, the destroyer was painted in an Italian blue-gray color scheme. Quite beautiful by all accounts, but very much not Soviet standard. It did earn her various nicknames, like the Blue Beauty or the Blue Cruiser. Tashkent arrived in the Soviet Union without any weaponry at all, and her twin gun mounts were experiencing delays as well. So, for her early service, Tashkent carried a temporary loadout of 3 single 130mm guns. That's hilariously underarmed for the size of ship we're talking about. Luckily for Tashkent's crew, it was a temporary measure. By February of 1941, she was in refit to receive her twin mounts. The 45mm guns were also taken off at this time and replaced by 6 37mm anti-aircraft guns. This is still a light loadout, all things being equal, but it was still an improvement. An improvement the ship would need, as it turned out. For Germany would invade the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941. Tashkent, wrapping up her refit, was sent to Sevastopol on July 10th to run her post-refit trials. She began a long and fruitful career of dodging German air attack during this process. They tried to sink her twice during her transit, and she evaded both attacks. That said, her power plant was proving temperamental, so the destroyer only actually saw combat in August of 1941. That combat consisting of bombarding enemy troops advancing on Odessa, with the odd break to hunt enemy shipping, such as it was, or escort Soviet shipping. Most of her time was spent on the shore bombardment, however. There was little in the way of hostile shipping, so for the start of the invasion, shooting up ground targets was all Tashkent could do. Admittedly, she was putting those 6 130mm guns to very good use. However, at the end of the month, on August 30th, things went wrong. Tashkent was attacked by enemy aircraft once more. She evaded direct hits, just like before. She did not, unfortunately, avoid damage entirely. The bombers landed 3 near misses, and as a lightly built destroyer, Tashkent suffered. The bombs blew a hole in her side, damaged a propeller shaft, knocked out hydraulic power, and buckled her girders. About as much damage as could be done to a ship without a direct hit. Nonetheless, Tashkent limped away to Sevastopol. 2 of her crew died, 7 were injured, and 1 was missing, presumably knocked overboard at some point. Upon returning to safe harbor, repair work for the damage was estimated to take 5 months. Through ingenuity and hard work, this was cut down, and Tashkent was back in service by November 1st. During this process, the destroyer picked up a twin 3-inch anti-aircraft gun on her stern. A good thing, too, because by that point Sevastopol was becoming a bit too hot. German and Romanian forces were drawing ever closer, and the city would soon be under siege and fighting for its life. Tashkent's crew would take their ship and support that defense. She fired on the enemy troops once again, and also made numerous supply runs in and out of the besieged port. This was dangerous business, and the Germans continually tried to sink the ship. Tashkent's speed served her well here, as she evaded attack. Aside from a short break to escort a convoy to the Bosporus in November 1941, Tashkent would spend the rest of her career in and around Sevastopol. From January to June 1942, she made progressively more risky runs into the city. These largely consisted of carrying Red Army reinforcements in, while taking wounded and civilians out, as well as supplies, the contents of the bank, and various other important things. Naturally, this wasn't what Tashkent had been designed for. But, like her Japanese counterparts in the Tokyo Express, she did the job well. The destroyer's size and speed came in handy here. She could get into and out of the port quickly, while carrying more than any other destroyer could hope to manage. Although, it couldn't last forever. After around 40 supply runs, Tashkent's luck ran out. She had carried thousands of tons of supplies into Sevastopol, along with thousands of soldiers. The destroyer had, equally, carried thousands of desperate survivors out of the city. On June 27th, after a final supply run, Tashkent departed Sevastopol with 2,100 wounded aboard. Early that morning, however, she was swarmed by German bombers once again. This time, while they still failed to hit her directly, the near misses were crippling. Holes were punched into the destroyer, her steering was damaged, and her forward boiler room was flooded. She took on about 1,000 tons of water and lost 59 members of her complement. 3 crewmen and 56 passengers, with another 15 wounded. While her crew claimed 2 attackers in turn, it was the end for Tashkent. She managed to limp to a flotilla of escorts, including a destroyer that took off most of the passengers. Another destroyer towed her to Novorossisk, where her story came to an end as German bombers appeared overhead on July 2nd, 1942. With Tashkent's speed useless, the crippled destroyer was finally hit directly at the dockside. This sank the tough ship in place. The Soviets would strip her guns and mounts, with most making their way to the new destroyer Ognavoy. The rest of the hulk was left there, as the Germans overran the port. They would partially scrap the wreck, but Tashkent remained largely intact when the Soviets retook the area in 1943. Unfortunately for Tashkent, her damage was too severe. Ignoring the water damage, the Soviets found her boilers and turbines destroyed and her keel broken, in addition to other damage up and down the ship. They refloated the wreck by August 1944, but only to beach her on a sandbar and clear her berth. Tashkent would remain on that sandbar until 1946, when she was towed off and scrapped. A sad end for a valiant ship, to be sure. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.